Listen close, friends, because this ain't your ordinary Wild West tale. It's a story of heartbreak and hope of a man who lost everything he held dear, yet still found a reason to reach out to a stranger in need. Picture a dusty frontier town caught between ruthless land barons, desperate ranchers, and cunning outlaws. In strides Jacob Green, a grieving widower, just trying to keep food on his table and sorrow off his heart. Little does he know that one scorching day he'll come upon a starving mother with twin daughters, and by saving their lives, he might just rescue himself. Jacob Green woke before dawn in a cramped bunkhouse on the outskirts of Garrison Gulch, a rough-and-tumble settlement nestled between rolling plains and treacherous canyons. Like many dusty frontier towns, Garrison Gulch had sprung up around two things: the promise of free land and the rumor of gold hidden in the rocky hills. That promise had brought all sorts honest folks with big dreams, crooked outlaws looking for easy marks, and a few men somewhere in between. The morning came with a chill that bit at Jacob's fingers as he struck a match against the worn sole of his boot to light a small lantern. Shadows danced on the walls, revealing the meager possessions he and his late wife, Mary, had managed to hold on to. A single photograph of Mary sat on the rough-hewn table, capturing her warm smile on the day they'd arrived at the gulch. Her long hair was pinned up with a simple ribbon, her eyes hopeful for the future. Jacob couldn't bring himself to look at the picture for long, for that smile reminded him too starkly of what he'd lost. Love, warmth, the promise of children who never came. He dressed quickly, donning dusty denim trousers and a faded flannel shirt. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots that had been resoled more than once, telling the story of his struggles to stay afloat as a ranch hand. He inhaled deeply, letting the scent of dawn fill his lungs, and braced himself for the day's work, rounding up a few stray horses from a neighbor's ranch in exchange for some coin. Stepping outside, Jacob paused. The horizon glowed with the earliest hint of sunrise pink and orange, bleeding across a dark sky. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and old wood, a fragrance that could lull a man into thinking the West was kinder than it was. Just then a sudden memory of Mary humming a lullaby at dawn tightened around his chest. He shut his eyes to keep the tears from falling and turned his attention to the waiting day. The bunkhouse door swung shut behind him as he made his way toward a small stable. Inside, a chestnut mare named Ruby waited, her ears twitching at the sight of him. She belonged to the ranch's owner, but Jacob had grown attached to her easy gait and gentle nature. He patted her neck and murmured softly as he bridled and saddled her. It was a simple routine, but it was comfort, a reminder that not all was lost. Jacob led Ruby out into the chilly air, vaulting into the saddle with a fluid motion. The old wood beneath him creaked in protest, but Ruby merely snorted and took a few confident steps forward. With a gentle nudge, Jacob guided her down the narrow trail that would lead him across the plains and into the day's obligations. At that moment, he had no idea how drastically his life was about to change. By mid-afternoon, the sun beat down mercilessly on Jacob's back. After hours of riding the perimeter of a neighboring ranch and herding a few lost horses, he was ready to return home. The job paid next to nothing, just enough to keep stale bread in his pantry and the occasional piece of salt pork. But it was work, and in Garrison Gulch a man couldn't be too picky. As he followed a winding creek bed to shortcut back home, a faint noise caught his ear. He slowed Ruby, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble, outlaws, cougars, or worse. Instead, he saw movement by an abandoned shack. The shack was a sorry sight. Its roof sagged like an old man's shoulders, and broken shingles scattered the yard. Rumor had it that the property once belonged to a prospector who struck silver only to die of fever the very next winter. Now the breeze carried a soft moan, like someone in pain. Jacob dismounted carefully, leading Ruby by the reins. He checked his 6-shooter, more out of habit than inclination. The West taught a man that trouble didn't always announce itself politely. As he approached, the moan turned into a weak cough. Then he saw it. A woman, gaunt and pale, cradling 2 small girls in her arms. One of the girls, both perhaps 5 or 6 years old, was unconscious, her face drained of color. The other had her eyes open wide with fear, but too weak to cry. The mother's dress was threadbare, and her lips were cracked with dehydration. Jacob's heart lurched. Memories of Mary flitted across his mind. She had always said that no matter how poor you were, you helped those who had it worse. He hurried forward and knelt next to them in the dust. "Ma'am," he said gently, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "You all right?" She tried to speak, but only managed a rasp. Her sunken cheeks and trembling limbs spoke volumes they hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. Jacob dug into his saddlebag, retrieving a canteen of water. He held it to her lips, letting her sip slowly so she wouldn't choke. The woman's hollow eyes filled with tears of relief. "Easy now," he soothed. "Take it slow. It's gonna be all right." He offered water to each of the twins, but one was too feeble to drink. Jacob frowned, feeling a surge of worry. "Ma'am?" he repeated gently. "Can you speak? Can you tell me your name?" Elizabeth," she managed, voice raw. "That's good," Elizabeth Jacob said, pulling off his bandana to dab sweat and dust from her face. "I'm Jacob Green. Let's get you out of this heat." He glanced at the shack. It might provide some shade, but not much else. A stench came from inside something rotting, perhaps a dead animal. It was no place to nurse them back to health. Worse still, the sun was dropping. If they stayed here overnight, the desert chill and scavengers would find them. With a firm nod to himself, Jacob decided on a plan. He helped Elizabeth to her feet, keeping one arm around her, while he scooped up the weaker twin. The other girl, leaning against her mother's skirts, clung with shaking hands. Slowly, carefully, Jacob managed to get Elizabeth onto Ruby's back. The children pressed close to her. For a moment, Ruby shifted, uncertain of the extra passengers, but Jacob patted the mare's neck with a calming whisper. "We're going to my place," he told Elizabeth, though he wasn't sure if she could process much. "We'll figure things out there." And that was how Jacob Green, an ordinary widower with little left to give, ended up rescuing a starving mother and her 2 twin girls. It took an hour to reach Jacob's modest homestead, a small cluster of rough pine structures he shared with a couple of fellow ranch hands. The main bunkhouse was where he slept. Tucked behind it was an older cabin that had once been the ranch owner's home before he upgraded to a larger, fancier house. The old cabin, though in disrepair, was still better than the abandoned shack Elizabeth and the twins had been sheltering in. He guided Ruby up to the bunkhouse, calling out for help. One by one, the ranch hands emerged. First was Old Bill, a grizzled man of 60 with a limp from an old bullet wound. Next came Toby James, a young rancher with an earnest face and permanent dust in his hair. And finally their cook, Marta, a stout woman who'd emigrated from Germany and could handle a frying pan or a shotgun with equal skill. As soon as they saw Elizabeth and the girls, the hands set to work. Toby helped the exhausted mother from the horse, and Marta whisked the children inside the bunkhouse. Old Bill's lined face creased with concern as he looked at Jacob. "What in tarnation happened, son?" They were in that old prospector's shack near the creek. Jacob explained, breathless. "Starving, half dead. Couldn't just leave 'em." Old Bill nodded, eyes drifting to the horizon. "We'll do what we can, but we don't have much ourselves." It was true. Their cupboards held mainly flour beans and whatever salted meats they could stretch until payday. But that was more than Elizabeth and the girls had. The ranch's owner, Mr. Hoffman, was away in Dodge City on business, so nobody could ask him for permission or extra funds. This was just something the ranch hands would have to handle on their own. Inside the cramped bunkhouse, Marta set about making broth, the rich smell of onions and thin scraps of beef filling the space. The twins lay on 2 spare cots, while Toby and Jacob helped Elizabeth into a chair. There, in the flickering light of an oil lamp, Jacob got his first real look at her. Elizabeth was perhaps in her late 20s, though her ragged appearance and the pain etched into her expression made her look older. She wore a simple dress that had once been a warm blue, but was now stained and torn. Her eyes, now half-lidded with fatigue, flickered around the room in cautious gratitude. Jacob gently pressed a warm mug of broth to her lips. She sipped. The tension in her shoulders ebbed fractionally, as if a part of her realized she was safe for now. Marta moved next to feed the twins. Clara and Rose Jacob would learn their names later, were near mirror images of each other. They had their mother's pale hair, but their eyes were different colors. One had green eyes, the other hazel. The soup revived them enough to flutter open their eyes and look around. Rose, the bolder one, tried to smile in thanks at Marta, who patted her hand kindly. Amidst all this, Jacob remembered how Mary had once yearned for children. The sting of that unfulfilled wish twisted in his chest, but he pushed the emotion down, focusing on the immediate need. "Thank you, Elizabeth," whispered, finally, her voice still raspy. "You saved us." Jacob shook his head, kneeling beside her. "Couldn't just leave you all out there." "Where were you headed?" Elizabeth opened her mouth, but paused, eyes shifting away in uncertainty. For a moment, Jacob thought she might not answer. Then, with obvious effort, she offered, "We were traveling, trying to find a place to stay after my husband died. We heard Garrison Gulch was a place we might find work. But we had no money, and the journey took longer than we thought." The mention of a dead husband panged at Jacob. He cleared his throat, understanding well the burden of grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," he murmured. She acknowledged it with a nod, a shadow crossing her face. "Thank you," she said softly. Then, eyes filling with tears, she glanced at her daughters. I thought I'd lose them too. I didn't know what else to do." Jacob couldn't bear to see that desperation. "You'll stay here," he said. "At least until you're well enough to figure out your next steps." A wave of relief passed over Elizabeth's features, followed by a flicker of pride. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Jacob said, though a nagging voice in his head reminded him how broke he and the others were. "We'll manage." Those words set in motion a series of events that none of them could have foreseen. A few days later, Jacob was surprised to discover how quickly Elizabeth and the girls made themselves at home. Not in the sense of taking up space, but in the warmth they brought to the bunkhouse. Before their arrival, the place had been a quiet refuge for tired men, with little conversation beyond the day's chores. Now there was giggling, albeit soft and weak at first, as the girls regained their strength. Elizabeth, too, pitched in, helping Marta with cooking and tidying up whatever meager corners of the bunkhouse she could. Mr. Hoffman's old cabin, once used for storage, was cleaned out, thanks to Toby's and Old Bill's help. Broken furniture and spiderwebs were swept away. The roof had a few holes which they patched with spare shingles. By the end of the week, the cabin looked almost livable. Elizabeth insisted on moving in there, saying she didn't want to crowd the bunkhouse. Jacob agreed with the condition that she still come by for meals while the girls continued to recover. And as much as he tried to keep a formal distance, something about this unexpected family pulled at his heart. The twins were curious and sweet. Clara, the quieter one, always watched Jacob with wide eyes, as if trying to figure out this tall, sad-eyed cowboy who had saved them. Rose was bolder, often whispering a shy, "Thank you, mister," whenever he brought a piece of bread or showed her the ranch's horses. In those fleeting moments, he found himself smiling, truly smiling for the first time in months. Elizabeth, for her part, was determined to repay Jacob in any way she could. When Marta was out, Elizabeth would take over the cooking, using her limited resources to whip up hearty stews that made the bunkhouse feel a bit more like home. Once the girls were strong enough to play outside, she'd let them wander a little, always under her watchful eye. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Jacob found Elizabeth outside the cabin. She was hauling a bucket of water from the well. Sweat beaded on her brow, and her arms trembled with the effort, still not fully recovered from her ordeal. "Let me take that," Jacob offered, moving to lift the bucket from her grasp. She flinched at first, then let out a quiet laugh. "Thank you," she said, letting him carry it. "I'm still not as strong as I'd like. But we're all healing faster than I thought possible." Jacob nodded, setting the bucket by the cabin door. "You're still skin and bones. You need to rest." Elizabeth leaned against the door frame, arms crossed protectively. "It's hard to rest when I feel like I owe you so much." Jacob pressed his lips together. "You don't owe me a thing, Elizabeth." She opened her mouth to argue, but then her gaze flicked to the two little girls chasing each other in the grass. The yard was dusty, the grass brittle, but it was a vast improvement over the skeletal shack they had left behind. Rose shrieked in delight as Clara tried to catch her. A heartfelt smile spread across Elizabeth's face, and Jacob's heart lurched. "I lost my husband a year ago," Elizabeth confided. "His name was Benjamin. We were trying to find a new life out here, but sickness took him. The girls and I have been wandering since." She swallowed. "Being alone on the frontier is terrifying." Jacob nodded slowly. He spoke quietly. "I lost my wife 2 years back. Childbirth complications. The dryness in his throat almost choked him. Buried her on a hillside near here. Ain't been the same since." Elizabeth's gaze softened, tears threatening. "I'm so sorry, Jacob. She must have been a wonderful woman." He forced a small smile. "She was. And she'd have done the same thing I did, help a family in need." Silence lingered between them. A gentle breeze carried the smell of hay and the distant call of a coyote. For the first time in what felt like ages, Jacob sensed there might be a spark of healing in his life. And maybe, just maybe, Elizabeth felt the same. But the West seldom let good things thrive without challenge. A week after Elizabeth and the twins settled into the cabin, trouble came riding in on horseback, accompanied by dust clouds and the thunder of hooves. A man named Everett Wilcox, dressed in a fine black suit, unsuited to ranch work, arrived with 3 armed riders at his back. Wilcox was a notorious landowner in Garrison Gulch. He owned a string of properties saloons and rumored gambling dens. He also claimed to hold deeds to parcels of land no one else dared question, lest they end up in a shallow grave. Jacob first heard the commotion when he was out in the yard fixing the fence that kept the horses from wandering off. He stood leaning his forearm on a fence post as Wilcox dismounted. The air bristled with tension. Toby and old Bill paused their chores, eyes narrowed. Marta peeked from the bunkhouse window. Wilcox tipped his broad-brimmed hat, face twisted in a smug grin. "Afternoon, gentlemen. I'm looking for Mr. Hoffman," Jacob replied evenly. "He's in Dodge City. Won't be back for a spell." Wilcox surveyed the ranch with a haughty air, eyes flicking over the bunkhouse, the stable, and then landing on the smaller cabin. "You folks taken in some new residents?" he asked with a sneer. "Heard rumors a woman and a couple of kids have been poking around. Possibly squatters." Jacob stiffened, forcing a calm tone. "They're not squatters. They're guests." Wilcox chuckled. "Guests, right. I have business with Mr. Hoffman about some unpaid taxes. Don't suppose you're up to speed on that, are you?" Jacob exchanged a wary glance with old Bill, who cleared his throat. "Mr. Hoffman pays what he owes." "Does he?" Wilcox said. "News from the territorial office in Fort Smith is that some ranchers around here have fallen behind. I'd hate to see the land seized." He paused, letting his threat sink in, then continued. "I'd also hate to see a good man like yourself get tangled up in others' problems. So how about you pass along a message to Hoffman? His extension for payment expires in 2 weeks. After that, the deed reverts to me." "You hold the deed?" Toby asked skeptically. Wilcox gave a sour smile. "In these parts, a man can acquire a great many things if he's patient." He turned to face Jacob again. "And if you care about that woman and her little ones, you'll tell them not to get too comfortable. This ranch may not be standing under current management for long." The riders behind Wilcox snickered, hands resting on their guns. The menace was undeniable. Jacob clenched his fists but kept his voice level. "We'll pass on the message." Wilcox tipped his hat again and remounted his horse. "Be sure you do," he said. "I'd hate to have to move things along in a less pleasant manner." With that, he spurred his horse, leading the group back toward town. A tense silence hung in the air, even after the dust from their horses settled. Slowly, Toby let out a breath. "You think that snake can really take the ranch?" Old Bill shrugged. "Wilcox usually finds a way. Man's cunning as a fox, moneyed as the devil. Ain't no telling what'll happen if Hoffman doesn't settle his debts." Jacob stared at the distant horizon, where Wilcox and his men had vanished. His mind raced with the implications. If the ranch was taken, he'd lose his livelihood, and Elizabeth and the twins would be on the road again this time, facing a man who had no qualms about using force to get his way. That evening, as he lay in his bunk, Jacob tossed and turned, haunted by Mary's memory and Elizabeth's uncertain future. He vowed silently that he wouldn't let Wilcox drive them out, no matter how powerful the man thought he was. Word spread across Garrison Gulch about Everett Wilcox's claims. The town was small, with only one main street of clapboard buildings. It boasted a saloon named the Silver Spur, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a lone church. The residents gossiped in hushed tones, exchanging rumors of Wilcox pressuring ranchers into selling or disappearing if they refused. In the midst of this tension, Elizabeth offered to work at the general store part-time in exchange for staples like flour, sugar, and canned goods for the ranch. She was no stranger to labor. After losing her husband, she'd tried her hand at anything that would help her and the girls survive. Mr. Connolly, the store's kind proprietor, agreed to let her tidy shelves and keep records. That arrangement brought a little relief to the ranch's strained provisions. The twins Clara and Rose were regaining their health. They spent mornings practicing their letters and numbers. Elizabeth taught them using a worn primer she had carried from place to place. Afternoons they roamed the yard around the ranch or helped Marta peel potatoes. Their laughter, though still tinged with the memory of hardship, gave the place an unaccustomed sense of home. Jacob continued his chores, sometimes taking side jobs around town to earn extra coin. He learned that Wilcox was pressing not just the Hoffman Ranch, but also others like the Mason Spread and the Rourke Homestead. Some were paying him off to avoid trouble, but rumors persisted of homesteaders who vanished after refusing his terms. Despite growing tensions, Elizabeth and Jacob found themselves occasionally sharing quiet moments. One evening, as Jacob was fixing a squeaky door hinge on the old cabin, Elizabeth came outside to watch the sunset with him. The sky was ablaze with fiery oranges and reds, the desert wind whispering through the parched grass. He glanced at her hammer resting in his hand. "Heard you did well at the store today. Connolly says you're a godsend." She smiled softly. "He's very kind. The girls were well behaved too. I think they like having a bit of routine." Jacob nodded, turning his gaze to the horizon. "Routine's nice out here. Gives you something to hold on to." Elizabeth's eyes flicked to the distant silhouette of a small wooden cross on a hill, Mary's grave. Jacob followed her line of sight. For a moment they both stared at it, a shared understanding passing between them. "Thank you, Jacob," she said finally, her voice low. "I know you've lost so much, yet you've opened your world to us." Jacob swallowed hard. "Honestly, I think you and the girls have done me good. Reminds me life can still go on." She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. His heart pounded to the warmth of her touch, unfamiliar yet comforting. But neither spoke of deeper feelings. The West was harsh, and both carried burdens too heavy to sort through easily. Even as a glimmer of hope shone between them, the spectre of Wilcox's threat loomed. Jacob lay awake at night, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, wondering how far he'd go to protect Elizabeth and the twins. A fierce windstorm swept across the plains a week later. Clouds rumbled overhead, and streaks of lightning illuminated the dusty yard. Jacob and Toby struggled to secure the barn doors while old Bill tied down the loose equipment. Marta hurriedly ushered the twins inside the bunkhouse, where Elizabeth was helping to salvage what supplies they could before the rain struck. The storm hit in earnest. Rain came in slanted sheets, the wind howling like a chorus of ghosts. In the darkness, Jacob heard the distant crack of a falling tree. Occasionally, lightning flared, revealing the silhouettes of the ranch buildings, a testament to the West's unforgiving might. As the night wore on, a frantic knocking sounded at the bunkhouse door. Jacob and Elizabeth exchanged worried glances. Could it be Wilcox's men? Or perhaps a traveler caught in the storm? Jacob went to the door, six-shooter in hand. He cracked it open to see an unfamiliar young man, drenched to the bone and shivering. "Please. Need shelter," the stranger gasped. "My horse spooked. I'm lost." Marta rushed to fetch a blanket while Jacob pulled the young man inside. He collapsed onto a rickety chair, water pooling at his feet. Once he caught his breath, he introduced himself as James Parker, a Pinkerton detective investigating missing homesteaders in the area. Yes, the Pinkerton Agency was a real organization, adding a note of authenticity to these strange times. "Missing homesteaders," Toby repeated, pulling off the man's soaked boots. "You talking about folks we suspect Wilcox might have run off?" James nodded, wiping rain from his eyes. "I've been hearing rumors. Families vanish, properties taken over by unscrupulous speculators. I had an informant in these parts. He sent word that Everett Wilcox was behind much of it. My job is to gather evidence and bring him to justice." Elizabeth clutched the twins close, fear etching her features. Jacob felt his heart pound. This was no longer idle gossip. A Pinkerton detective's presence meant the threat was real, and so was the chance for justice if they were brave enough to help. While the storm raged outside, James explained that he suspected Wilcox had alliances with corrupt officials. Homesteaders behind on their debts or land taxes were easy targets. Wilcox's men might ambush them on the trail, burning their homesteads to erase the evidence. The land titles would then mysteriously pass to Wilcox, who sold them at a tidy profit. "We've seen it happen before," James said grimly, sipping a cup of steaming coffee. "But we need hard proof. Witness statements, documents, anything that ties Wilcox to these crimes." Jacob exchanged glances with the others. Finally he spoke, voice quiet but firm. "If there's a way to stop Wilcox, we want in." Old Bill grunted in agreement. Martha nodded. Elizabeth, though fearful for her daughters, set her jaw. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep my girls safe," she murmured. James gave a weary smile. "Appreciate it, folks. For now, let me stay here until morning. I'll head into town after the storm to see if I can gather more leads." "Stay as long as you need," Jacob said. He had no idea how dangerous this alliance would prove, but it felt like the first real chance to protect everyone from Wilcox's iron grip. That night, sleep was restless. Outside, the wind shrieked, and the bunkhouse trembled under nature's fury. Inside, Jacob wrestled with the knowledge that his decision to stand against Wilcox could cost them dearly. Yet, as he listened to the soft breathing of Elizabeth and the twins, he resolved some things were worth the fight. The morning after the storm, the yard was littered with debris. Broken branches, scattered shingles, and muddy pools tarnished the ranch's appearance. The scent of wet earth permeated the air, but at least the sun now shone, and the breeze was mild. James Parker prepared to depart for Garrison Gulch, eager to follow fresh leads. Before leaving, he took Jacob aside. "Keep an eye on anyone approaching, especially folks who seem too curious about your new guests. Wilcox's men might try to flush you out." Jacob nodded, glancing at the cabin where Elizabeth and the twins slept. "We will. Watch yourself in town." James rode off on a borrowed horse, leaving behind a swirl of dust on the now sodden road. Meanwhile, the ranch hands set about cleaning up storm damage. Elizabeth and the girls joined in picking up fallen branches and sweeping water from the cabin floor where the roof had leaked. Despite the hard work, there was a sense of renewed purpose. They weren't just surviving, they were preparing to defend the land and each other. Late that afternoon, Elizabeth approached Jacob with an anxious expression. "I need to speak to you. Privately," she said, glancing at the twins. They were playing in the yard, chasing an old rag ball Toby had given them. Jacob led her to the barn, a bit away from curious ears. The smell of hay and horse was strong, and dust motes danced in golden beams of sunlight, streaming through the cracks in the walls. Elizabeth took a breath as if steeling herself. "I haven't told you everything," she confessed, eyes downcast. "My husband Benjamin, he had a small savings he hid away. We were robbed after he died. I barely escaped with the girls. But I managed to keep some documents he left behind." She retrieved a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. Unfolding it with trembling fingers, she revealed a deed, an official land title from another county. Ben inherited a small plot of land near Fort Smith. It's not much, but it's rightfully ours. Problem is, some folks want to claim it for themselves. That's partly why we came this way, trying to hide from them. Jacob's gaze flicked over the document. "Does Wilcox know about this?" Elizabeth shook her head, tears brimming. "I don't think so. But I suspect the men who robbed us might have been working with him, or someone like him. They were after valuable deeds. A surge of protectiveness burned in Jacob's chest. You think Wilcox might come for you if he finds out? She nodded slowly. That's why I've been so afraid to trust anyone. But you saved us. I can't keep this secret any longer. Jacob ran a hand over his stubbled chin, eyes locked on the official seal. Your land near Fort Smith. It might be the difference between your future and losing everything. Elizabeth let out a ragged breath. Exactly. I was hoping if we can get there eventually, the girls and I can start anew. But I need enough money for a proper journey. Money I don't have. And I'm scared Wilcox's men or others might track us down. Jacob folded the paper gently, pressing it back into her hand. You keep it safe. For now, we'll focus on stopping Wilcox from taking Hoffman's ranch. Then we can figure out how to get you and the girls to Fort Smith. Tears slipped down Elizabeth's cheeks. She stepped forward impulsively and clasped Jacob's hands in hers. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Jacob looked into her eyes, a warmth stirring inside him that he'd thought died with Mary. He lifted one hand to brush away her tear. For a moment he considered drawing her into an embrace, but she pulled back, remembering the precarious situation they were in. They parted without further words, each feeling the gravity of all that remained unsaid. Twilight cloaked the ranch in a dusty gold hue, as the sun dipped behind the western hills, stretching long shadows across the yard. Jacob stood near the bunkhouse, eyes fixed on the trail that led from Garrison Gulch. Something in his gut felt off, like the calm before a lightning strike. The meeting was days away, but the air already hummed with tension. James Parker had just returned from town, having gathered more documents linking Wilcox to forged deeds and bribery. Inside, the others huddled around the bunkhouse table, reading the evidence. Toby was shaking his head in disbelief. Old Bill muttered a curse under his breath. Marta kept the twins close her eyes, flitting to the door every few seconds. Elizabeth leaned over Jacob's shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think he knows? He knows, Jacob replied, jaw tight. And he'll come before the meeting. He won't let this go to a judge. They didn't have to wait long. As the last rays of sunlight bled from the horizon, the thunder of hooves echoed down the trail. 5 riders crested the ridge, Everett Wilcox at the front, dressed in a dark riding coat, his hat pulled low. The men behind him wore hardened faces and loose holsters. Each one carried the cold confidence of a hired gun. Jacob stepped out into the yard, standing tall with Toby and Old Bill at his sides. James flanked them, his Pinkerton badge hidden beneath his duster, but his revolver ready. The horses came to a halt in a cloud of dust. Wilcox dismounted slowly, eyes scanning the scene like a predator assessing prey. Well, well, he drawled. Didn't take long for you to turn my town into a courtroom green. You thinking you can play hero now? Jacob didn't flinch. You've threatened and stolen from too many good people for too long. That ends now. Wilcox chuckled coldly. That ledger Parker's been waving around, a pile of scribbles from drunk barkeeps and bitter ranchers. You think a judge'll believe that over me? We've got sworn affidavits. Witnesses. A marshal arriving in time for the meeting, James said, stepping forward. You're not untouchable anymore. Wilcox's smirk faded, replaced by a simmering fury. You brought marshals into this Pinkerton or not, you've crossed a line. He nodded to his men who shifted in their saddles, hands brushing pistols. Careful, Jacob warned. There are women and children inside. Wilcox's eyes flicked toward the cabin where Elizabeth and the twins watched from a narrow window. Funny thing about family, he said. Makes a man weak. Makes him hesitate. Jacob's blood ran cold. Old Bill cocked his rifle with a metallic click that echoed through the still air. We ain't hesitating, Wilcox. You draw and we'll drop every one of you right here. Tension tightened the yard like a coiled spring. The riders hesitated. Wilcox's arrogance had always been his weapon, but it wasn't working now. He'd expected fear. What he saw instead were steady eyes and ready hands. Then the bunkhouse door opened and out stepped Elizabeth. She held her chin high, her eyes locked on Wilcox. You came here to scare us, she said, loud enough for all to hear. But you don't scare me anymore. Wilcox's lips curled. Is that right? A starving widow thinks she can stand in my way. I'm not starving anymore, she said, and I'm not alone. Behind her, the ranch hands emerged one by one. Toby Martyr, even a few neighbors who had quietly joined their cause after hearing whispers of the Pinkerton investigation. A few held rifles. Most just stood with clenched fists and determined expressions. Wilcox looked around, and for the first time he realized he was outnumbered. This isn't over, he hissed. You think a town hall and a couple of paper pushers will stop me? It's already started, Jacob said, stepping beside Elizabeth. You're standing on land you tried to steal, and tomorrow the whole town's going to hear what you've done. James raised his voice. If you or your men make one more move against this ranch or anyone here, you'll be arrested before you take your next breath. The moment stretched. Finally, Wilcox spat on the dirt. We'll see who the law listens to. He turned sharply, mounting his horse. You've made enemies today. You'd better pray your lawmen are faster than my bullets. With a flick of the reins, he galloped away, his riders following reluctantly. Silence lingered long after they disappeared into the darkness. No one spoke until the only sound left was the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Elizabeth exhaled. Was that a warning? Jacob nodded. His last one. James holstered his gun. Tomorrow will be the real fight. That night, the ranch didn't sleep. They took turns keeping watch lanterns burning in every window. Elizabeth sat near the twins as they slept, her hand never straying far from the small pistol Jacob had given her. Jacob stared into the fire outside, haunted by thoughts of Mary, of the life he'd lost, and the new one he was trying to protect. He wasn't a gunslinger or a politician, but he was done staying quiet. At sunrise, they would ride into town, not as victims, but as witnesses, defenders, and voices for everyone Wilcox had tried to silence, and come what may, they would face it together. The sun stood high in the unforgiving sky, bearing down on Garrison Gulch with a dry heat that shimmered off the dusty streets, but the heat didn't stop the townsfolk from gathering. News of the public meeting had spread like wildfire, drawing ranchers, merchants, miners, and drifters alike to the town square. They came not for politics, but to witness what many hoped would be the downfall of Everett Wilcox, the man who had long held the territory in a chokehold of fear and corruption. At the edge of the crowd, Jacob Green stood tall beside Elizabeth and her twin daughters. Clara and Rose clung to her skirts, their wide eyes darting over the sea of strangers and tension-charged faces. Behind them, the rest of the Hoffman Ranch crew, Old Bill Toby and Marta, stood in silent solidarity. And just a few paces away, James Parker, the Pinkerton detective, kept a watchful eye on the proceedings. his hand never far from the revolver on his hip. The mayor, a red-faced man with a thinning hairline and a handkerchief perpetually dabbing at his brow, climbed a few wooden steps and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice unsure against the murmurs of the crowd. "This meeting has been called to allow grievances to be aired concerning the recent disputes over land ownership and taxes within our county." Polite applause followed, thin, wary. The people weren't here for the mayor's formalities. They were here to see if anyone had the courage to name names. The first to step forward was an older rancher named Eli Rourke. His voice trembled not from age, but from fear. "Everett Wilcox sent men to my property," he said, gripping the podium like it was the only solid thing keeping him standing. Said if I didn't sell for pennies, he'd make the land his anyway. 2 nights later, my barn burned down. Gasps and whispers rippled through the square. Wilcox stood near the rear of the crowd, arms folded, flanked by 4 hired gunmen. He didn't flinch. Another rancher stepped forward, then a third. Similar stories, threats, disappearances, deeds changing hands under suspicious circumstances. Each testimony chipped away at Wilcox's armor. Then Jacob stepped up to the podium, his heart steady, but his hands curled into fists. Elizabeth stood at his side, calm but resolute. She gently ushered the girls to Marta before joining Jacob on the wooden platform. "My name is Jacob Green," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I've worked the land here for years. A week ago, Everett Wilcox rode up to our ranch with armed men, said we were harboring squatters, referring to this woman and her children. He gestured to Elizabeth, who stepped closer. Elizabeth took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I lost my husband while trying to build a new life for my girls. We sought shelter at the Hoffman Ranch. Wilcox's men came asking questions, intimidating us. I saw one of them try to corner a neighbor's wife. These aren't just business disputes. They're threats meant to push families like mine out of the territory." Some townsfolk lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others nodded the truth they'd known, but never spoken, finally finding a voice. Wilcox pushed his way to the front. "Lies," he snarled. "All of it. This is a witch hunt led by outsiders and cowards." James Parker stepped forward, holding up a thick, weathered ledger. "This ledger was recovered from the Silver Spur Saloon," he said. "It details bribes paid to the county assessor, falsified tax records, and unlawful acquisitions, names, dates, signatures. All of it points back to Everett Wilcox." Gasps again. The mayor reached for the ledger, scanning the pages with growing alarm. "You expect us to believe this?" Wilcox barked. "You bring a Pinkerton into our town, stir up lies, and hand him forged records. This is nothing but theater." "No," James said firmly. "It's evidence, and I've brought sworn affidavits from multiple witnesses to back it." Wilcox's face darkened as he turned to the crowd. "These people are trying to take what's mine. You think any of them would survive out here without men like me holding the line?" That was when James raised his hand, signaling 2 men who had been standing discreetly near the rear. They stepped forward, badges gleaming in the sunlight. "Marshal Henry Marston and Deputy Wright of Fort Smith," James announced. "They've reviewed the evidence and agreed it's enough to issue a formal detainment." A murmur turned into a stunned silence. Wilcox's eyes widened as the marshals approached. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Marshal Marston didn't blink. "We've got the law, and this town's had enough of your kind." Wilcox's men reached for their guns, but seeing the steady hands of the marshals, they hesitated. One by one they backed down, leaving Wilcox alone. The marshal snapped cuffs onto his wrists. "I'll be back." Wilcox growled, his eyes boring into Jacob and Elizabeth. "You've made enemies you can't outrun." Jacob didn't flinch. "Maybe. But we're not running anymore." As Wilcox was led through the crowd, a spontaneous wave of clapping broke out, slow, hesitant at first, but growing louder as the townsfolk realized what had just happened. The tyrant of Garrison Gulch had fallen, and it was ordinary people who had brought him down. Elizabeth reached for Jacob's hand. He took it without hesitation, their fingers lacing tightly. For the first time since the storm had brought them together, Jacob felt the wind shift not with danger, but with promise. The fight wasn't over, but for now justice had finally found its place in the West. In the weeks that followed, Wilcox was taken to Fort Smith to face charges. Hoffman returned from Dodge City to learn of the dramatic events at his ranch. Grateful that his employees had defended his land, he settled his debts promptly and promised to invest more in the ranch. Life in Garrison Gulch took on a new energy, no longer overshadowed by Wilcox's bullying. Elizabeth continued working at the general store, saving every cent she could for the journey to her late husband's inherited property near Fort Smith. Meanwhile, Jacob repaired fences, wrangled horses, and formed a quiet camaraderie with the mother and her twin girls. Each day, the lines of separation blurred. The bunkhouse and the cabin became a shared home of sorts, with Marta teaching the girls how to bake bread, Old Bill showing them how to whittle little wooden figurines, Toby entertaining them with stories of cattle drives, and Jacob simply being there, a strong presence they'd come to rely on. One crisp morning, about a month after Wilcox's arrest, Elizabeth approached Jacob with the girls in tow. She held a small burlap sack and a folded piece of parchment. "We're ready," she said, her voice trembling with both anticipation and sadness. "I've saved enough. We can make the journey to Fort Smith." Jacob felt his heart clench. He forced a supportive smile. "That's good. You'll have your own land, a chance to build a real future." Elizabeth nodded, looking at the twins who clung to her skirts. "I want them to know security, a place of our own." But she hesitated, biting her lip. "We can't imagine leaving you behind. You've done so much." Jacob took a deep breath. He gazed at Mary's grave in the distance, remembering the promise of a life they never had. Then he looked at Elizabeth and the twins, so full of promise and hope. Quietly, he reached for her hand. "I don't want to hold you back," he said, voice rough with emotion. "But if there's room for one more on that journey, I'd like to come with you." Clara and Rose's faces lit up with delight. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, a smile blooming. "We wouldn't have it any other way." They left Garrison Gulch in a small wagon paid for with Elizabeth's wages, and a bit of help from Mr. Hoffman. The ranch hands gathered to bid them farewell. Toby gave the twins new straw hats. Old Bill slipped Jacob a worn but functional revolver for protection on the road. Marta pressed a freshly baked loaf of bread into Elizabeth's hands, tears shining in her eyes. With the wagon loaded, Elizabeth and Jacob sat side by side on the driver's bench, the twins nestled safely in the back among blankets. As the horses trotted away from the ranch, dust swirling behind them, Jacob cast one last look at the place where he'd buried Mary. He felt a pang of grief, but also a swell of gratitude. In saving Elizabeth and her daughters, he'd found a part of himself that had been missing, a reason to live, to love, to keep going. The journey to Fort Smith would take days, maybe a week. Dangers still lurked on the open trail, bandits, wild animals, unpredictable weather. But they went forward with hope, carrying each other through the hardships. In the hush of early morning, Elizabeth's hand found Jacob's. She squeezed it gently, meeting his gaze with a silent promise they would face whatever came together. And so under the wide western sky, the struggling widower, who had once lost everything, now rode beside the mother and her twin girls, unaware at first how she would change his life, and now fully embracing the truth of it. The West was harsh, but in the midst of dust and danger, new beginnings were always possible. Love could bloom again, even where sorrow had taken root. And in that fragile promise, they traveled on, leaving behind a chapter of survival and forging a future built on faith, family, and the powerful hope that had carried them this far. As our tale draws to a close, remember this. The West was never just about danger or dust. Sometimes it was about second chances. Jacob Green, hardened by loss, found hope again by reaching out a helping hand. Elizabeth Clark, clinging to survival with her twin girls, discovered that accepting help took as much courage as offering it. Their story reminds us that even in the fiercest storms, compassion can light the darkest skies, and strangers can become family when fate has other plans. If this journey touched your heart, please do us a favor like this video. Share it with friends who love a good Wild West drama, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, resilience, and unexpected grace. Every click of support helps keep these stories alive and keeps the spirit of the frontier burning bright. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next adventure.